Next Friday morning, we're going to light a fire. We're going to make a fire at 11:30 in the morning at the back of Bonai Shalom. You're invited to come if you like and bring your chametz, and we're going to burn the chametz on the fire. And this act of burning feels like so visceral, so tangible. We smell the smoke. We watch the last bits of our chametz going up in flames. Earlier today, I went down into the kitchen, which is bare bones kitchen because it's been stripped out after the flood that we had. Oi. And I went into the fridge to get a little bit of grape juice to put into the Kiddush cup for Kiddush that we're going to say in a moment here. And when I opened the fridge, there are still 5 lulavim left over from Sukkot sitting in the fridge, still with their myrtles and their willows in the arbor minim, in the 4 species. And as I saw them, I thought, great, we can start the fire with them, because there is a tradition of taking the lulav from Sukkot and using it to start the fire on which you burn the chametz for Pesach, as a way of saying we have continuity between this mitzvah and that mitzvah, between Sukkot and between Pesach, which is starting next Saturday night. And there's something about that way in which we mark time in this particular time, where time has been so extraordinarily unusual, as we start thinking about Pesach, and that we're still, many of us, going to be on Zoom Seders after being on Zoom Seders last year. Some of us are going to be having small gatherings in person, but we are far from back to normal. And here we are still, a year later, more than a year later, still in this unusual way of being in community. And yet there are wonderful blessings that have come out of it. Next Shabbat morning is Shabbat Hagadol, the Shabbat that always precedes Pesach. And it's unusual when Shabbat Hagadol is actually the morning of the Seder, because the Seder starts after Shabbat next Saturday night. And traditionally, the rabbi on Shabbat Hagadol would give a whole sermon about how to get ready for Pesach, how to get rid of the chametz, what chametz really is, what it is spiritually and emotionally, as well as what it is physically. How do we do this? How do we get ready? But there's no way that that's going to happen next Shabbat, because if you're not ready before Shabbat, then there's nothing that I'm going to say or anyone else is going to say to help with that. Because the idea this year is actually that we get completely ready before Shabbat comes in, which is why we burn the chametz next Friday morning. Normally it would be on Erev Pesach, but we're not going to make a fire on Shabbat morning, so we burn it then. But what is that fire really? What does it mean to burn our chametz? I want to talk less about chametz and rather how that fire relates to what we read in the Torah this morning. How that fire as a ritual. And some of us love making bonfires, don't we? I remember growing up, like, bonfires were so exciting. They still are. A campfire, sitting around a fire. It's so primal. It brings us back to, what we imagine our ancestors sitting around a fire. The original Pesach, where families would sit around, each like with their own Pesach sacrifice, and they would roast that lamb on the fire and sit around and take some matzah and take some lamb and eat it. And in a way, the way that Judaism has evolved, the way that we practice Judaism today is so different to the ancient world. And we can read the text from Vayikra, from Leviticus, and be disgusted and appalled by it, especially those of us that choose not to eat meat. We can be like, oh, animal sacrifice, how barbaric, how primitive, how awful, like taking an animal and slaughtering it and dashing its blood on the altar and taking out all its entrails. That's gross, we can think. But actually, I think there's some real depth to that. And I think that in some ways, and I have no idea if this is really true, but in my imagination, it's true, that our ancient ancestors had a much healthier relationship to animals and to meat than we do today. Because there's no way that the culture of sacrificing animals, of taking something that was precious to you, something that was actually part of your household, something that you were bringing to express remorse or gratitude or just because you wanted to offer something that was going to be an olah, that was just going to be burnt up in flames, just as a way of offering something that belonged to you, that was part of you, and offering it up to a higher place, but knowing that it was something that was a sacrifice in the sense that this was something for many of these families, they were not wealthy people and their animals were precious parts of them, and they would bring it. And they would offer it. And in the case, as I said, of the Zevach Shlamim and of the Chatat and the Asham, they would sit down and have a feast with it, just as the Pesach sacrifice would be a feast. And those would be the occasions that people would eat meat. They wouldn't eat meat the rest of the time. So that to me is so different and so much healthier than just going to a supermarket and buying a piece of flesh wrapped in clear plastic wrap and saying that's how me. This really wasn't. I'm not. I promise you, this is not going to be a Devar Torah that's going to be about trying to convince everybody to give up meat. That's not my intention at all. My intention is to just talk about what we can learn from this amazing culture, this amazing ancient culture that is very easy to dismiss as being disgusting and primitive. We are heirs to a tradition where every part of religious life involved our full being, our full bodies, the whole idea of a reach nichoach of smelling our prayers, of tasting our prayers, of touching our prayers, of touching our sense of worship. As I said earlier this morning, for the rabbis, these sacrifices, these korbanot, and the word korban and sacrifice are very different. Korban is almost always translated as sacrifice. Sacrifice in English is really about giving something up. But a korban is from the verb lekarev, which means to draw near or to bring or to come close. Kruvim are our relatives, the people that we are close to. And another oddity of this year, we've come close to distant relatives, but only through a screen. We haven't actually been in physical proximity. But the sacrifices were about proximity, about coming close, about bringing ourselves, about bringing that of ourselves, about coming close to community, to family, to each other, to God, to our deepest selves. That's what a korban really was all about. And those offerings were, as I said, just experienced in a very visceral way. Sometimes our modern Jewish practice can be so intellectual. It's so in our heads and not in our kishkas. It's not in our guts. There's something about reading about the guts that takes us into our guts, right? The klayot, all of the kidneys and the entrails and all of that stuff. When we read about it, we go there a little bit, right? And the rabbis do say, if you read and study about the korbanot, it's ki'ilu. It is as if you have performed them. And so they're not necessarily suggesting that we should post-temple. In fact, they're definitely saying we should not continue with a system of animal sacrifice post the destruction of the temple. It was a form of worship that was reserved to the temple. And many people, including Maimonides, thinks it's an evolution and a positive thing that we sort of grew out of that need to worship in that particular way, and that our korbanot, our sacrifices, evolved into tefillah, into prayers, and into ma'asim tovim, into good deeds, and into teshuvah. Rather than taking a sacrifice to expiate a sin that we've done, we have a system of teshuvah where we can actually look inside, where we can make amends, where we can seek forgiveness from the people that we may have hurt. And so that's an evolution, according to Maimonides and other thinkers. Some people pray for a restoration of the third temple. Some people actually want to go back to a system of animal sacrifice. I don't. I make that very clear. I don't. Even sacrificing tofu. I mean, and yet, our of course, the rabbis tell us that our Shabbat table, our Yom Tov table, the way we celebrate Chagim with family, with friends, with community, that becomes like the Mizbeach. That becomes like the altar. That becomes like the altar in the temple. And so it's not just about the korbanot becoming tefillot, becoming prayers, becoming this avoda shebalev, this worship inside our heart. It's also about our Jewish rituals kind of being a little throwback to the idea, rather than just sitting down and having a meal and not thinking about the food in any other way other than just fulfilling a physical need to eat. We make it into a sacrificial feast. We imagine ourselves like Kohanim. We imagine ourselves like priests in the temple. We wash our hands Before we eat challah, we put salt on the challah, which is, you know, something that would be accompanied with the sacrifices, as if to say, this is not just a piece of bread. This is a korban. This is a sacrifice. And I'm enjoying this feast with my family, with my community. Halavai, we should get back to having feasts with our communities. Many of us have had too many meals alone during this pandemic. And so we know that, I read once that in studies of communities and cultures where there's extraordinary longevity, where people really live long, long lives, one of the common factors they found were long, slow meals in community. One of the factors to living a long life is long, slow meals in community. And I think of Shabbat meals that go on for hours and hours with people around the table, sharing that meal with us. And it's a very powerful, a very, very powerful ritual, and something that we definitely look forward to going back to. So we spent weeks reading about the details of the construction of this Mishkan, of this tabernacle, right? Just all of the, not just the physical materials, the gold and the silver and the crimson and all of the colors and the richness and the skins and the poles and the hooks, everything that went into the construction of that Mishkan, that sacred space, that holy space, which was going to give a sanctuary for God to dwell in it. And as I said earlier, once it was complete, God's presence came in. And we make this big shift now to not what the nature of the space is, but what happens inside that space. Once we have a beautiful space, once we have a beautiful sanctuary, once we prepare you and I to come back into this physical space, once we, God willing, in the future have our own brand new, please God, building across the street, a new space, what are we going to do in there? Who are we going to be as a community? What is the flavor of our prayer life going to be? What is the nature of our spiritual existence going to be? Who are we going to be in terms of how we treat each other and how we treat the community beyond ourselves? All of that has to come into question. We can't just think about space without thinking about what we do in that space. And that's why having now a whole book that really talks about ritual is really an invitation and an opportunity for us to think about, how do I want to come back? Is my relationship to prayer and community going to be different after COVID? Is my relationship to prayer and community going to be different once I dream of being in a new space? As Rabbi Shefa Gold says so beautifully, when she talks about prayer taking the place of sacrifices, she said, can the word of a prayer engage the senses fully? Can we taste it, smell it, touch it, feel its blood, hear its music and the silence within it, witness its passage into the void, see in it the shadow of death and the spark of life? Do we leave our prayer feeling purified, our burdens lifted? I'd love us to imagine together that prayer can do that. That prayer can be something that we can feel with our whole bodies, that we can taste it and smell it and touch it, that we can feel both life and death within it, pulsing through it, just as that life and death pulsed through the animals whose lives were taken in this ancient form of worship. I would love to think that every time anybody in this community does a mitzvah, does a holy and sacred obligation in the name of the divine, in the name of Jewish culture and Jewish heritage and Jewish lineage, or any time anyone does ma'asim tovim, performs good acts, gemilut chasadim, righteous, holy acts for each other, that we're not just doing them with a sense of worn out obligation, but we're doing them because we know that that's what's right and that's what we need to do in sacred space, and that's what we need to do in Kehila Kadosha, in holy community. That's what it means to be part of this incredible tradition to which we are heirs. Not that we are physically taking animals and taking their lives away, but that we are imagining the impact of that. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs quotes a seminal and important teaching from the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the Alter Rebbe, who talks about the idea that in the second verse of Parshat Vayikra, it talks about the sacrifices in a very unusual phrase, and it says mikem, from you, from you, from you. It's talking about the fact that what we bring as a korban, what we bring is something from within ourselves. And what the Alter Rebbe says is that it is described as being behema, that all of these sacrifices come from a behema, right? From a behema. Behema is the word is usually describes domesticated animals, which are the animals that are appropriate to sacrifice. But in Hasidus, in the mystical thought of the Hasidic communities, and it was wonderful hearing Sarah and Jack bringing down through words and through music about the fact that your lineage is so steeped in Hasidic Rebbes, so steeped in that tradition. In Hasidic thought, the behema is not something on the outside, it's something on the inside. And so the Alter Rebbe talked about the nefesh habehemit, the animal soul, the animal soul. And the idea of an olah, of a sacrifice that is burnt and consumed completely, is that we take that piece of ourselves that, and I'm just seeing, I saw Bonnie holding your cute puppy, or I don't know if it's a puppy, but holding your dog. And I, you know, as many of you know, oh, and there's another puppy. Bina has a puppy too. And I think of the relationship that I have developed with my own dog during COVID. So it's very hard to talk about an animal soul in a very negative way when we know how incredibly loving and loyal animals can be, especially dogs, but I think a lot of animals. But nevertheless, the nefesh habehemit is this idea that we have a piece of our soul that is just working on pure instinct. As I said before, when a meal is not just about feeding our bodies, but about feeding our souls in community. The idea of not just eating because we're hungry and we want to eat, you know, and not just all of the other things that animals might do to satisfy an immediate momentary desire on a physical level. The nefesh behemit is that animal piece of our soul that we offer up, that we burn up, that we refine, that we elevate. And it's very similar to the fire that I mentioned at the beginning, the burning of the chametz, because the idea is that this chametz is externally, of course, it's bread and it's pasta and it's all of these things that the Torah tells us we're not going to not only not eat for a week, but we're not going to even have ownership over. We're not even going to see them in our homes. It's all going to be like gone. We get rid of it all. And of course, externally, we know what that is, bread and cake and cookies and all of that stuff. But internally, we know that chametz can be about the Yetzer Hara. It can be about our own inclination to do evil. It can be about our egos. It can be about our arrogance. It can be about the times where the world called us, like Moshe was called at the beginning of this parsha, to show up with humility. And we didn't show up with humility. We showed up with puffed up sense of who we are, like the chametz is puffed up. And the idea of burning the chametz is very similar, I think, to taking an olah, taking something onto a fire and burning it up. So we burn up those pieces of ourselves that can just behave like animals, and we refine ourselves like human beings. And we burn up and offer up our shame. I just cannot help thinking about the way in which shame, and very often it is sexual shame, if we don't really just look at it and embrace it in a certain way as just being a part of who we are, it can come out in a most appalling shadow, as we saw this week. And that's part of our system, I think, of prayer and sacrifice too, that we look with honesty about who we are. And that if there are parts of ourselves that we want to offer up in prayer, that we want to offer up in our spiritual practice, that we want to burn on a fire, that we can use the emotional and spiritual technology that we have available to us in Jewish tradition to really look at that in an honest way. Some of us, I think, and I will include myself, get very caught up with some of the language of this that talks about tam'im, about everything that we offer up has to be perfect, has to be unblemished. The animal has to be a male and it has to be unblemished. And if the Kohen, you bring, and you imagine this, just imagine this for a moment. You are not a wealthy family and you are just getting it together. You really, really feel this dedicated place in your heart where you want to bring something. And all you can afford is a little pigeon, because birds could be sacrificed too. That was, there was a great equality in this. If you were really wealthy, you could bring an ox. If you were poor, you could bring a bird. And you're trembling and you're bringing with such humility and such reverence. You're bringing this bird, and then the Kohen takes it and looks and says, sorry, it's got a little blemish on it. We're not going to be able to sacrifice it this morning. I'm sorry, have a nice day. Can you imagine how humiliating and awful that would be? And can you imagine how, like, we, from a place of sincerity, are offering our own prayers, and there's some force up there saying, yeah, sorry, your prayer was a bit blemished today. I think again and again and again of that wonderful Leonard Cohen song, Anthem, where he says, ring the bells that can still ring, forget your perfect offering. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the life gets in. And we know that in so much thought, Hasidic thought, but also contemporary spiritual thought, there's a wonderful book which was actually written by people primarily from the AA movement, the 12 Steps movement, called The Spirituality of Imperfection. The Spirituality of Imperfection. This is not about being perfect. None of us are perfect. And as we know, perfect is the enemy of the good, or the enemy of the great, whatever that quote is, right? It's not about being perfect. In fact, it's about bringing our imperfection onto the Mizbech, onto the altar of this fire. It's about knowing that when we do the best that we can do, and we all have different practices and different ways we do it, but when we clean for Pesach and we do the best that we can do, and we know that there's still chametz, there's still chametz. There's still chametz in our cupboards and there's still chametz in our hearts. But when we burn them on the fire, we say, I've done what I can do this year. And this isn't about you, it's about me. I'm not looking at I'm not judging what my fellow community member or other family members are doing for Pesach. It's about me and my journey and my process. All of this is very much about the individual practices that we have. So the other thing that Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, in quoting the teaching from the Alter Rebbe from Shnei Zalman of Liadi, says is that there are these other three categories that the animals are described as. They come from bakar, which is cattle, son, which is a flock, and what's the third one? I just blanked out on what the third one is. Bakar, son, and Bakar, son. Oh no, it's Behema. I already mentioned Behema. So Behema, Bakar, and son, right? So Behema is this, the Nefesh HaBehemit, the animal soul. Bakar, which means cattle, is from the same root, Beit Kuf Resh, as Bakar, which is morning, which the root meaning is about breaking through. And son is a flock. And so what Rabbi Jonathan Sacks says so brilliantly, I think, is that Bakar is he talks about having to respect the boundaries of tradition. But I want to have chutzpah and say, I think it's also about when we have to break the boundaries of tradition. Bakar is about breaking through boundaries and also respecting boundaries. And so sometimes our prayer, our sacrifice, sometimes our prayers have to be breaking through. Like, how do we break through this boundary? And sometimes it has to be, I have to stay within this boundary, right? And then son, the herd, the flock, what Rabbi Sacks says is that that's about the herd mentality. You know, we talk about herd immunity in COVID-19 terms, but herd mentality can be so incredibly dangerous. So our sacrifice, it has to be unique to us. It's yichidi. It's unique to me. It's not about anyone else. Just as my relationship to chametz is unique to me. I'm not going like, what is Rabbi Jack doing with his chametz this year? Huh? It's like none of my business what anyone else is doing with their chametz this year. All I can be responsible for is my chametz, right? And sometimes in the herd mentality, we get so caught up in being like going with the pack. And sometimes that can be awful. It can be violent, as we've seen on January the 6th. The herd mentality, being so caught up in a particular narrative that we are incited to violence. Or, you know, the herd mentality can lead us to hatred and intolerance. The herd mentality can make us judge others rather than look at what the work is that we are doing for ourselves. And so the idea that we have this nefesh habahimit, this animal soul that we can elevate on the fire, that we have an opportunity with bakar, cattle, meaning boker, like the morning, we can break through into a new, like we can break through into out of Mitzrayim and into a new place of expansiveness, of new possibilities by bringing those particular types of korbanot, those particular offerings. And the tzon, that we can get out of this sense that I have to do what everyone else is doing and that I'm doing what is right for me. I'm being called, just like Moshe is called at the beginning of this parsha, in my unique way. So as we enter into this book of Vayikra, which is all about the korbanot, may we each find ways in which those practices are meaningful for us, that we can deepen our spiritual lives as we are in this transition point of moving into a different reality where we will be gathering a little bit more with each other, and that what we do in sacred space can be just as significant, more significant than the space itself. It's not about buildings. It's about the intentions of our hearts and practices within those buildings. And so that we, as we prepare and as we hope and as we yearn to come back together in community, that we will come back together in new ways where we will treat each other so kindly, that we'll offer up prayers with such depth, that our prayer life, our ritual life, our spiritual life as a community will just be a reach nichoach l'Hashem. It will be a pleasing odor to God, and that we will continue to thrive as a community of deeply practicing and deeply kind and compassionate people, both as individuals and within the community. And hope to see some of you at the bonfire next Friday morning at 11:30. Shabbat Shalom.